Hello and welcome to Lab 14, Aeolian Geomorphology and Desert Landscapes. These videos are provided for you as really a step-by-step, page-by-page instructional guide. I'll also be providing tips, tricks, and other things to just get you through these labs a little bit more effectively and efficiently. These are also very effective for when you're reviewing for exams and you have to go back and remember how you did some of the activities in these labs. These videos are really helpful for that. So as we can see, the objective of this lab, we have explain how arid regions are classified. We'll also learn to analyze the spatial patterns of human-induced desertification. We'll also analyze the relationships between grain transport and size distribution, and we'll also learn to identify erosional, depositional, and other Aeolian landscape features. That being said, let's start Lab 14. So welcome to Part A, Arid Region Classification. So we know that with nearly 1/3 of the Earth being either a desert or arid land, essentially meaning that evaporation exceeds precipitation, there's so many different ways to categorize climate. Now, for the purpose of our lab, we're going to look at just three main names that we're going to be able to use. We're going to call them extremely arid, arid, and then semi-arid. So extremely arid means that the region must be dry, no precipitation for at least 12 consecutive months. Now, arid lands means that it does have some precipitation and it needs to be less than 250 millimeters per year. Semi-arid means that you have between 250 and about 500 millimeters of precipitation per year, so still not a whole lot. To put it in perspective, the average rainforest receives over 200 inches of rain per year. So we're talking, really just even for semi-arid is less than 20 inches total, so only a tenth of that. So Question 1 says, refer to figure 17.1, which is a fantastic diagram that was put together by our friend Scott for this lab. And what you can see is it's a map projection of the entire world. We can see that there are lines of latitude, and we can also see, based on color and patterns, we can look at the degree of aridity across the world. So what it does is it has you look at particular spots and locations. You might need to use Google or an atlas to kind of locate where these places are, such as the Sahara Desert or the Patagonia Desert. But it's asking you to really observe this map and then make interpretations based on that. Something that can also be observed here when looking at these maps is, why do we have aridity? Now, it is explained earlier on, just on the previous page, but I think that you really get a sense of reasons why these regions can be arid. We find that latitude certainly plays a role, continentality or location, and distance from water itself, but we can also look at just the topography. This map that we're looking at shows no topography, yet when I'm looking at it, I see topography because I see that there's a correlation with landscapes and landforms along with precipitation values. All right, so let's look at desertification. So this is actually a really interesting topic. Perhaps you've read such great books as The Grapes of Wrath, or just really understood more about the Dust Bowl besides the Great Depression as its own, is that the Dust Bowl itself that occurred, that caused such a huge migration and so many turmoil and tragedies, was human-induced alone. So we learn in specific here that desertification is the shift from perennial grasslands to shrublands that occurs globally to impact nearly 40% of Earth's land surface and nearly 1/5 of all the world's human population. So we can see this diagram here, desertification photo series showing, a pre, during, and after. And essentially what we're saying here is that it is possible for humans and for nature as well, but predominantly with human impact, can create a desert region based on the things that we do, to then evoke or to put stress on our natural environment. So we can see that there's additional pinpoints that kind of explain this, talking about things such as due to excessive use of soil in agriculture without diversifying the agriculture itself and the soil contents, that you can create soil erosion and also essentially making the soil sterile, which is what happened in most cases out in Oklahoma and some of the Midwest. So again, moving into more of these contexts, and we look at figure 17.3, which shows the areas as low, moderate, or high risks of desertification. Now, I know that the image itself is kind of small, but it's more of just to kind of put in perspective. I would even suggest looking at this map and scrolling up and looking at the one in the previous part and see if you just observe any correlations. But question 2 has you reference this figure 13.7. And it says to first list the spatial patterns at risk. Do you see patterns? Are there patterns such as latitude? Are there patterns such as population density? Are there patterns that you can observe and interpret based on this map using the worldly knowledge that you have gained throughout this and your other academic journeys here at the college? Also, question part B says compare both this figure and figure 17.1, and what relationships do you observe there? And that's really kind of introducing the ideas of desertification and how we look at our arid regions. So let's look at part B, grain transport and size distribution, something that we've talked about in other labs as well. Material has the ability to move. Much like it does with water, air as well is considered a fluid and can move material very similar to that in which it moves in water. So what we can observe here is, I'm just going to jump straight into this diagram, figure 17.4, that we can see that due to wind velocity, that material is able to move from one spot to another. Now the way that this can move is one of 3 ways. It can move as traction, otherwise known as surface creep, which means those are the material that are just too big to become airborne, so they roll along the bottom. About 25% of all material in aeolian environments is moved that way. There's also what we consider suspension. Suspension makes up another 25% of all material that's moved, and that's the stuff that can become airborne. And not just airborne. I mean, we're talking that it can be pushed up into the atmosphere. An example of suspension would be a dust cloud that occurred over in 1998 in California out in the eastern Sierra that picked up a tremendous amount of material out in the middle of the desert, and they were able to watch it and watch the migration of that material in the atmosphere, and it was deposited as far as Africa. So that material can be suspended. And then lastly is saltation, which makes up about 50% of all material that is moved. And that's just, the idea of saltation is bouncing. So something becomes suspended, and then when it impacts and hits other material, that energy is transferred and it bounces along. Saltation also makes up a lot of the material that is moved and creates abrasion on surfaces. Questions 3 and 4 have you evaluate what you learn about these types of motion that material can be moved in, as well as that diagram. And it's having you answer some questions based on summaries and also based on your observations. So now that you understand the 3 prominent ways in which material can move, it's also important that we look at the grain size, because grain size certainly has an effect on how it's moved, not just velocity alone. So this little table here is a grain size classification table. Most of us that go in the field have a little booklet that we get to open up, and it actually has the exact same information but samples, texture samples of each type of grain size. So it says here below you'll find a table from the International Organization of Standardization, which establishes the basic principles for identification and classification of soils based on the material and the characteristics most observed, such as size. So what we can see here is you have the name on the left, the classification name, very coarse soil. It can be broken up into 3 parts, and then there's obviously special little codes that go within it that are great for research articles. But for our purposes, we're really looking at the names and the size range. So we're looking at size range of millimeters. So anyway, we can see that very coarse material is greater than 630 millimeters and moving all the way down until we get into microns. So then we can move into question 5 and 6, which is using your critical thinking skills. After reviewing the table, why do you think it's important that we understand grain size? Using your critical thinking skills, assuming a location is doing research, and what type of grain size would you expect to find? Think about also what type of grain size do you think would be considered creep or traction versus suspension versus also saltation? Could you put a line on here and try to distinguish where that is? And I think that over time you'll be able to learn that using some of these tools provided in the lab. So then moving forward, we can now interpret that data. So let's interpret those names and skills that we have in that graph and apply it to actual photos of grains. Now we know that, when we talk about like sand, and we've talked about this in coastal labs, sand refers to the grain size, not what it's made out of. So when we look at, at our material that's out on our landscape, it can be very diverse. In fact, I can see one that looks like it's got seashells based out of it, some that's got more quartz and feldspar, some that's incredibly fine. So what we're doing here is we have samples A, B, C, and D. Your job is to establish the average grain size, and then you're going to be able to link it to what name best describes it. Now, the way that this was done is these are using images using a microscope, and we zoomed in, took a photo of these samples, and then used a bar to represent the scale or the size of that material. So based on these, and look, as an example, I'll point at view letter A. That's really, really small grain material. So that's microscopic material, so it's harder to do that. It's easy to do the larger grains. The best way to do this, just from a rule of thumb, is you just try to measure 5 or 6 very clear grain sizes with the little bar that you can use here, and try to get the average. You measure some big ones and some little ones and try to get the average. The way that I did it, which I think works really well, is I used an index card, and I marked the index card as to what type of scale was being used, and then I went there and I just kind of moved my index card around to kind of get averages, and I wrote down 5 or 6 for each one to try to get a name or to know what the average grain size was. And that's how you complete grain size analysis using something like this. How is this done in the lab, though? It's a little bit different. It's called a laser particle analyzer. It's pretty neat. You put the material into a glass and a laser shoots through it and refracts and measures the grain size, and also comes up with the chemistry of each type of material, which is pretty cool. And that wraps up part B. Much like in other labs, we're able to observe both erosional and depositional features. So we're going to be looking at part C, erosional Aeolian landforms. So landscapes formed from the work of wind result from either the removal of fine particles or the sculpting effect of materials moved in this environment. So one of the things that we can look at are deflation, desert lag, desert pavements, playas, arroyos. These are all different types of features in landscapes that can be observed due to erosion. So first thing to start off, we've also got a little QR code, hyperlink, click that as well, QR code, scan with your phone. This takes you to a Google Earth location in Badwater Basin, which is the lowest point in North America, negative 282 feet below sea level. And you're able to really view some tremendous desert-scape landforms. Also, if you're just into it, there are additional videos, my Out in the Fields, and I did a lot of research and made some wonderful videos showing some of these large features and landscapes out in Death Valley, so I hope you get a chance to check those out. I think it just really helps to be able to place the place with the names, and it's much easier to see it in that type of perspective. So let's talk about some of these landscapes and some of these materials that are going to be eroded. The first are going to be lag deposits and desert pavements. So lag deposits and desert pavements really bring you into the fact that, much like the word implies, deflation, when all of the sand and material is blown away, what are you left with? You're left with coarser grain material. So we often can find landscapes like that. Moving into buttes, mesas, and plateaus, through additional erosion, in this case, a lot by water, which is interesting. Because remember, we acknowledge that deserts are classified based on their lack of precipitation. As an example, Death Valley only gets about 2 inches of rain per year. But they do get it in one large event, and it's a tremendous amount of water over such a massive landscape that flash floods occur, and excessive erosion can occur at that rate as well. So it's interesting to think that when deserts and arid regions do not have a lot of water, but when they do, they get these torrents, which then create these landscapes. So it's kind of weird to think that water is an incredibly active piece of the development of these landscapes. So buttes, mesas, and plateaus are very similar to one another. The biggest difference is their size alone. Buttes are what I think of like bar stools, so they're taller than they are wide. Mesas are like tables, so they're wider than they are tall. And plateaus are just like pretty much every diet I've ever been on. They go on forever, and they never go up or down. It's just one big flat surface. So you can kind of work through these definitions as to what they are. which then brings us to figure number 17.7, which is a classic little drawing that's asking you to identify the plateau, identify a mesa, and also to identify a butte. Also, label an additional 2 features that are shown in the diagram. So you might want to review some of the other context and vocab words on the previous page. But it is asking you to look for 2 other additional landforms that you have learned in this lab and perhaps in other labs as well. Question 10 says, now that you've learned how to observe and interpret these different locations, let's identify them on a map. So this is looking at a drawing. This one here is a topographic map. This is Wedding Cake, New Mexico, and a topographic profile that we're going to be able to observe. So where do you find a butte, a mesa, and also a plateau? Again, there are many answers, many correct answers, so just pick one of each, which is okay if it's different from your other classmates, but remember, although there are many correct answers, there are some bad ones, so make sure you stick on the good ones. That being said, that wraps up Part C. So Part D is entitled Depositional Aeolian Landforms. So this is going to be a little bit different. We'll spend a little bit more time because there's a lot more depositional landforms than you would think in these arid regions. So let's start off with sand dune development, because before we can start with anything, we need to learn how the dunes themselves are developed. The first thing we can see is figure 17.9, where we can observe both the stoss or windward side as well as the leeward side on the dune, meaning that we know that the wind grains are going from one side to the other. In that process, it's moving material up this face and dropping it on the slip face on the opposite side. Again, additional resources are provided there. Question 11 asks you to then apply what you've learned and talk about this diagram. What would happen if no additional material was being provided? What would happen to that sand dune? Or what would happen if a lot of extra sand was available in that landscape? What do you think would happen and why? Then we move into sand dune properties. The shape and design of a dune vary with 2 things: the amount of supply of sediment you have, as well as the wind variability. Something that we can talk about when it comes to wind variability is whether it is unimodal or bimodal. Unimodal means that there's one direction, one flow of wind. Bimodal means that there are more than one. And then lastly, we have complex, which just means it's a hot mess, that wind's coming from all kinds of different directions. So using your critical thinking skills, questions 12 for A, B, and C ask, what are an example of what you might experience these type of winds? Have you ever experienced one direction, 2 or multiple directions? And explain why or why not you experience that and what you think causes it. Then you move into this diagram, 17.10, sand dunes by wind variability and sand supply. This is a great diagram, even though it has no imagery to it, but it's because it really itemizes the types of dunes that are available based on sand supply and wind direction variability. So if you have very limited sand supply and not a lot of wind variability, it's probably going to be a barken dune. But if you increase the amount of sand available in that desert region, you're going to have transverse dunes, and so on and so forth. So the reason that I'm using this diagram is because I want you to evaluate this image to think about, okay, I can see how there can be a pattern with sand supply and wind variability, yet without putting any images to what these dunes look like. And that's what question 13 is doing, is asking you to really understand this table, because once you understand it, you're able to move on and to talk about very specific types of dunes. There's lots of different types of dunes, more than what are observed here. One of my favorite that's not on here are called they're called Nebka dunes, and it's essentially a vegetative dune. A plant somehow is able to grow in the middle of the desert or in an arid region or even on coastlines as well. And then the sand builds up around it, the plant gets bigger, the sand builds up around it, gets bigger, and then at some point the sand all blows away and you're left with this very awkward looking thing. But that, when it's a sand-based dune, a vegetative sand-based dune, we call those Nebkas. They're very common in California coastlines. Also that you can find them out in Death Valley at the Devil's Haystacks. So what I've provided for you are a list of different sand dunes in no particular order. You need to identify first if it is unimodal or bimodal. That's the first step. Then the next step is using this data. We're going to go to this page where you have all of those dunes present in some form of a drawing. Beautiful drawing, huh? So anyway, you're going to identify each dune, and then you're going to then identify the windward side of that dune. You're going to identify the slip face or the leeward side, and you're also going to draw arrows indicating the direction or directions in which you feel the wind is blowing. So you're going to be able to then apply and match all the words on that previous page to all the dunes that you have in this diagram here. And I think that's a great way of learning how to do that. I also suggest, if you have the time, when you were checking out Badwater Basin, if you check out a place called the Mesquite Dunes, you can see some of these sand dunes there on Google Earth as well, which is pretty cool. And maybe you've seen them. Maybe you've been out to the desert and been able to, crawl amongst them. Other features that we can observe are going to be alluvial fans and bajadas or bajadas. So alluvial fans mean, well, alluvium, let me back up, is the word that's given to material that has been brought in by water and deposited out in a desert region. So we often find these phrases to summarize, all material that's been moved by some form of geomorphic process. So we can observe that this is an alluvial fan. It's a fan shape, and all the material came from one place and dumped out onto that surface. That's an alluvial fan. Now, bajadas, or bajada, which means slope, means that there's more than one touching, coalescing. So if my hand represents a fan, and I have another fan out of a different canyon and they overlap, we don't call it alluvial fanses. It's not, you can't make that a plural word. It's either an alluvial fan or it's going to be bajadas, because they're overlapping or coalescing. So what you're going to do with this Google Earth image that I pulled off of the internet using Google Earth, this satellite imagery with the contour lines on it, it says, using a colored pencil or pen, outline and label the farthest extent or the perimeter of the alluvial fan observed. Then, by using the scale bar in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see this is a representation of 4,900 feet. Measure the width of the alluvial fan from its source to the material's edge, and then by measuring the actual length or the perimeter of itself. So you're going to be doing some measurements using that scale bar. I think the easiest way to do it is to, again, use that index card, draw it out there, and just kind of map it along the way. But the reality is I want you to be able to measure this one single fan and look at its complete width and depth all the way around. And you're going to find these are really, really large. In fact, there's a freeway down there that wraps around that fan, and you can hardly see it. It's right, here's my mouse. It's right here, and that's a freeway. So just to kind of put in perspective as to how large these features are. Well, again, these alluvial fans and bajadas develop because of the flash flood material that comes out of the arroyos and canyons that gets flooded out and gets deposited on the playa surface itself. Then, here we go, Google Earth, scan it, QR code, or click the link, takes you to a very, very, very large alluvial fan in Death Valley. Figure 17.3 below is asking you to use colored pencils and to describe some different attributes. This is, again, another image that I took from Google Earth. And we're looking at a collection of alluvial fans and bajadas. And go ahead and answer those questions based on your observations. Make sure you check them out first, looking at the Google Earth. And then we have loess deposits. So these are really unique. It's a clay and silt-sized sediment that's been deposited by wind. These deposits are very common in arid environments and also downwind of most glaciers. During ice ages, these deposits in areas were adjacent to the continental glacier that essentially ground the rock into incredibly fine powder. Approximately 10% of the Earth is covered by a loess deposit. So this map is showing us the regions in which loess deposits have been identified. And this comes in quite helpful because next lab that we'll be looking at 15 is looking at glaciated topographies. So that being said, using your critical thinking skills, why do you think these deposits often make up productive agriculture soils? Explain your responses in 1 to 2 sentences. And that's the last part of this lab. So let me just recap a couple things. We got to learn a little bit about sand dunes, alluvial fans, bajadas, playas, all kinds of different features, both erosional and depositional. We learned that deserts are classified based off of their amount or lack thereof precipitation. And we also learned how to identify many of these features in our landscape. Again, I have shared additional videos. Check out my YouTube channel for some out in the field videos of Death Valley. I've got a handful there so you can really relate these wonderful landscapes. Something that I want to end with, which is very important, which is covered in your lecture course, is that we classify deserts based off of their precipitation. Deserts are not always hot. There can be cold and they can be hot. Death Valley can be 120 degrees during the day. It can also be below freezing at night. So deserts may be hot and cold, but they are always dry. Be sure to comment below if you have any thoughts or questions. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next lab.